Since the beginning of this year, we've seen a huge uptick in Somali pirate attacks, attempted hijackings, as well as successful hijackings, something we haven't really seen in years, arguably since the first wave taper off around 2013. And more than that, you've seen attacks on very high-profile targets, such as petroleum tankers, and indeed a vessel carrying Turkish arms to Somalia. So right now, there have been over a dozen attempted attacks, attempted hijackings, and I believe now there are 6 commercial vessels being held in the custody of pirates in Somali waters near the shore of Somalia. My name is Jay Bahadur, and I'm a senior researcher for Global Initiative, and also co-director of consultancy Scopus Insights. I think the event for me which catalyzed the recent wave of Somali piracy was the successful hijacking, not of a commercial vessel actually, but a Chinese fishing vessel in January. This wasn't really reported in the mainstream media, but it was the second time this vessel had been hijacked, and either the shipping company or the Chinese government or some combination thereof ended up paying a ransom of between $1.2 and $1.5 million for this vessel. And this was in January. And immediately after that, you saw an uptick in activity, and then they started successfully hijacking commercial vessel, commercial shipping, and these are the attacks that have made it into the media. But for me, it was the fact that a ransom was paid. And the moment you pay a ransom, it's like chum in the water, and you have all sorts of groups forming, trying to get their own piece of the action. So a lot of analysts have directly imputed the events in Iran and the security situation in the Strait of Hormuz as correlating or being responsible, I should say, for the recent surge in piracy. I'm not sure it's so clear cut. Again, I think it was the allure of ransom, this recent ransom that started the recent uptick in activity. But one effect possibly that the Hormuz crisis is having is that the Indian Navy has been distracted elsewhere. And when we saw the most recent surge prior to the current climate was around 2023, 2024, where you saw a number of hijackings. You even saw a $5 million ransom paid. But in most cases, the Indian Navy was extremely engaged in counter-piracy operations and actually launched a number of successful rescue operations to free vessels that had been taken by pirates. That's all changed now, I think, with the Hormuz crisis. Senior Indian naval officer I spoke to a while ago was quite adamant that the country's priorities have shifted away from counter-piracy to preserving their own energy security for their own vessels coming through the strait. And in a way, he also said that the geopolitical situation has shifted greatly since 2023-24, where he essentially said that multilateralism in naval operations is sort of dead. And, if the U.S. is going at it alone, why should we be spending resources to combat kind of a multilateral problem like piracy? It's just not as important for us anymore. That said, I mean, there have been recent instances where the Indian Navy has intervened, but you haven't seen the kind of large-scale, almost commando rescue operations that you saw a few years ago. When I wrote my book almost more than a decade ago, the conclusion the book reached was that these were generally groups, very loose forming networks that coalesced around shared either clan lineage or shared family, in some cases just friends. But the capital outlays to start a pirate operation are very small. Everyone brings their own weapon. You need some fuel. You might need a boat. And then generally now what happens, they go out and try to hijack another vessel to kind of serve as a mothership for their operation. So it's not like these are long-standing, coherent organizations. They tend to just be networks that spring up very quickly when the opportunity arises. You'll have, in many cases, like a lead financier, and then a lead head of the attacking team. And there can be more than one financier. It can be kind of like a joint share invest, kind of a joint shareholder operation. It very much depends. Generally, when I was researching this in depth, generally the investors would get about 1/3 to half of the profit from the operation, with the rest going to the attacking team and the guards that would be brought on board. But what I think where it gets expensive is there's not the actual launching of the operation, it's the costs you incur once you actually are holding the ship. So the ransom negotiations can take months. During that time, people, the pirates on board want food. They need food, obviously. They want spending money. They want cox, this narcotic leaf that is like chewed compulsively in the region. So that and they often are, they have to, the financiers have to supply this in very remote areas, using 4x4s to supply the vessel, and obviously small skiffs to run out the supplies and so on to the vessel. So I think that, and if that goes on for months, or in the past it's gone on for over a year or more, that's what really drives up the costs, and that's what the investor kind of has to cover while they're waiting for their ransom. So the case of the petroleum tanker Eureka, which was hijacked in early May, very close to the coast of Yemen, I think there was, in this case, very strong evidence of direct Yemeni involvement in the hijacking. This is not something we've seen before. We've certainly seen Somali pirates operating near Yemen, but not this close to the coast that we saw in the case of the Eureka hijacking. The Eureka was hijacked 2 to 3 miles off anchorage in a Yemeni port called Bir Ali. And indications are that there was Yemeni intelligence coming from the port about the vessel's course, port call schedule, and so on, which led to this vessel specifically being targeted, which is also something we didn't really see in the past. So if this is the case, and there have also been reports, not only in this instance, but in others, of actual Yemeni nationals on board pirate attack groups, and the groups actually launching from Yemen themselves, which is a new development. As I mentioned in a report for Global Initiative, there's also some Yemeni military intelligence reporting we've seen that indicates that a number of individuals involved in the Eureka hijacking had also traveled to Houthi areas beforehand to meet with Houthi officials. I don't think we've seen yet a strong argument for direct Houthi involvement in Somali pirate attacks. And I think there's a couple reasons for that. One is that the pirates are generally only concerned about hijacking for money. It's generally an opportunistic crime where they'll take any target they can get. They're not targeting specific nationalities or specific shipping companies, specific assets of one country or the other. It's not a geopolitical game for them, where it is very much for the Houthis, obviously. And when the Houthis have decided to either attack commercial shipping or, in some cases, hijack vessels, you know it, because they end up landing on them with helicopters. So the Houthis are operating, they're fully capable of carrying out their own piracy operations if they want. It's not something they don't need to rely on quite frankly, very sort of technologically basic operations coming out of Somalia, and logistically basic. They have much greater assets at their disposal if they want to disrupt international shipping. And then I'd say another counterpoint to the argument some have made that the Houthis are directly involved is that the most recent hijacking was of a vessel that was sanctioned by the U.S. for essentially being a shadow Iranian oil tanker delivering fuel to Houthi ports. So if this was the case, why would the Houthis ever have targeted a piracy group to target an Iranian asset? It doesn't make much sense. And for those reasons, I think that the argument of direct coordination between the Houthis and pirate groups has been overstated. However, there's no doubt in my mind now that there is the involvement of Yemeni nationals and Yemeni individuals, and I think that is a completely new development in the Somali pirate space. So if piracy reemerges as a profitable business model, and if ransoms start being paid again, as it seems they will and must be, well, the first effect I think you'll see is pirate groups will have money to reinvest in further operations. So what we saw in the past, obviously, is when groups started making money, not only did other groups imitate them, but the successful groups themselves would proliferate and send out more and more missions based on the fact that they have the capital to reinvest. Another consideration is that with the Hormuz crisis going on, already the threat to international oil supplies that's occasioned, the Gulf of Aden Red Sea waterway is particularly vulnerable at this time, and you could see not only pirate attacks along with Houthi attacks on shipping could affect the global economy in a way that they might not have a decade ago, especially with relation to fuel supplies. As we mentioned, a number of the vessels hijacked so far have in fact been fuel suppliers, fuel tankers. Another thing we've seen in this recent trend is there's been a slight change in the type of individuals we've seen engaged in these attacks. So established arms smuggling networks in Yemen and Somalia have turned specifically to piracy. There's evidence I've reviewed that groups that routinely engage both in bringing weapons from Yemen to Somalia and also facilitating human smuggling, the movement of migrants from Somalia to Yemen, are now engaged in pirate attacks. And in fact, elements of them may have been involved in the Eureka hijacking, the ship we mentioned that was hijacked in May, and have attempted other hijackings. So this is a new development, and I think the risk is that if you're seeing kind of a coalescing of forms of maritime crime, arms smuggling, human smuggling, in some cases illegal fishing, and now piracy. And if those groups do tend to coalesce into more long-standing or established organizations, that could be more of a threat in the long term. Not to mention the fact that they actually seem to be targeting specific vessels based on information provided by individuals in Yemeni ports. So that's another development. That's something very concerning, that if you see that these groups start developing like an intelligence network in the Gulf of Aden that supplying information on transiting vessels, and this leads to specific targeting of vessels, this could be something that persists into the future, even if piracy as a whole drops off.